Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I guess you could choose whichever time zone best suits your viewing of this video. Really excited to be with you this day. Talk a little bit about the next essay that we'll be writing in the class. This will then be a video that's going to give you a little more advice and maybe a little more clarification on the upcoming poetry essay that goes with our poetry unit. So, I hope so far that you are enjoying reading the poems that are presented for your study in this unit. It's good to have this assignment in mind as you read through the poems in this unit. If you've read the assignment sheet and you're viewing this video early on, it's going to help you identify and choose really a poem that will be useful and successful really for this assignment. I hope also that you've had some time to reflect on the last essay that we wrote, some time to review some of the sections in the handbook to help you avoid maybe some error patterns that you may have had in the last essay with the hopes of avoiding them in the future. So again, as I did with the reflective essay, this advice video on the poetry essay, I'll spend just a little time going over the assignment sheet with you in a little more detail and at times clarifying and at other times maybe amplifying some of the assignment's features and some of its requirements. So you may or may not have thought about this or had an occasion to think about it, but writers, more often than not, are quite avid readers, and they often like to read about the process of writing, and they like to write about their own work and the work of others. And that makes sense. And so when I put together this assignment, I was thinking of Robert Frost, who is without a doubt probably the most, well, without a doubt or probably, which one is it, Dr. Calatrello? Well, I'll go ahead and say it. Without a doubt, without a doubt, the single most widely read and popular American poet of the 20th century. He wrote about his process of writing poetry, about his art, and in doing so, he wrote that a poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. And it seems to me that he's right. And I have often thought about this quote and have it in my mind when I sit down to read poems. And so I thought that this quote would make a great sort of seed, if you will, for this poetry writing assignment. Let's first talk about the quote again. Let's read through it again. A poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. Well, what do you think he means by that? What's he getting at? A poem begins as a lump in the throat. Is he meaning that the poem quite literally begins with one of these sort of emotive sensations? Or is he talking about the process of writing a poem? I don't think there's a definitive answer. I think that it could be either or both and. But if you think about it, any work of art, or I should say for any work of art, there must be inspiration to create. Would you agree with that? Right? We just don't sit down and, if you're Herman Melville, decide I'm going to write Moby Dick, or if you're T.S. Eliot, you just don't sit down and say, I'm going to write the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, or, well, you get the picture. There has to be something, doesn't there? Some flash, some moment of inspiration that causes an artist to want to create something, to express themselves, right? They have something to say. They have something that they want to communicate to the reader, to the world, and maybe, in fact, to themselves. So it could be that what Frost is saying here is that you know what it's like when you get a lump in the throat, right? You feel that that sensation like you can't really swallow because you've witnessed something incredibly emotional, whether it's intense grief, nostalgia, sadness, emotions such as that. You get that sort of lump in your throat. I think you know what a sense of wrong means, right? That there's some sort of injustice, something's not right, something is morally offensive, or homesickness, right? We all know what it feels like to feel that longing to be at home, to be in a space that you're familiar with people that you're familiar with who know you and that you know them. And when you're separated from that, how we long, right, to be back home, where we belong, emotionally and spiritually and physically, with the people who know us and love us despite all of our faults and frailties, right? And you know what a love sickness is, right? We've all experienced some kind of romantic stirrings, right? And you feel that longing for connection with, in a romantic way, with another person. So this quote is an interesting one when you think about poetry. And I want you to have this quote in your mind as you're reading through these poems. Because as you're reading through the poems, you're going to be, if you do this, you'll have this idea of what caused this poem to be written. Which aspect of Frost's quote seems to be in play as I read through this poem, if in fact Frost is right. And let's concede and let's agree that Frost probably knew a thing or two at least about poetry, and its nature, its origins, the crafting of it. And so if we can agree with Frost that a poem begins this way, as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness, if we have that notion in our minds as we read through these poems, it will help. Because what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to ask you to choose a poem, any poem that we've read in this learning unit or any poem that is in our textbook, except for Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken. I will blind myself if I ever have to read another essay on that poem. So that's the poem I'm putting off limits. But you can choose any other poem. And what I want you to do is sort of explicate it. And for more on explication, you could look at pages 1113 or 1113 to 1125 in your textbook, the section that's called Writing About Poetry, in the event you are using an ebook or the Kindle version of our textbook. But what I want you to do is choose a poem that you think, as you read through it, it occurs to you that this is precisely what Frost is talking about. This poem, somehow fulfills, really exemplifies and illustrates Frost's observation about how a poem begins. I want you to use the quote. I want you to use Frost's assertion as a springboard into your discussion. And so let me be very clear. The thesis in your essay should go something along the lines of identifying the poem that you have selected and then asserting that it, in fact, fulfills or illustrates or demonstrates or exemplifies, whatever word you want to use, Frost's notion about how a poem begins. Okay? I don't want you to use any secondary sources. I don't want you to go to the internet or to Google or to any of the databases. You don't need to do that for this assignment. Okay? So I don't want you to do that. I want this to be your original reaction, your original reading and analysis of the poem, and how it certainly, as you're asserting, seems to be right in step with Frost's ideas about how a poem begins. Okay. I've given you again this section, writing about poetry, to review as you craft a draft of your essay. I'm happy to look at drafts. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about the assignment or about any aspect of your assignment. I don't proofread essays, but again, I'm always open to working with you. If you want me to look at something and just say, hey, can you tell me if I'm on the right track with this? Okay. If you don't want to do that, that's fine as well. I've given you a sample essay that was written by a student for this assignment. It's in our learning unit, so I think that if you read through the sample student essay, it should give you really a good sense of what this assignment should look like when it's completed. Let's talk about the guidelines. It needs to be between 2 and 3 pages. This means at least 2 full pages of text, not 1.5, not 1 3/4, not 1 5/8. You need to be well into 2 pages and maybe hopefully onto your 3rd page, which you should be able to do with an assignment of this nature. It needs to be typed and double-spaced and formatted using the MLA format. Let me talk about this requirement. I noticed a lot of this in the last essay that we did. You need to craft this essay in the 3rd person point of view, the objective academic point of view. Now, with the reflective essay, we could use I, the personal pronoun, because that was what the assignment called for. It was asking for you to introduce into your essay elements of your biography, of your personal experiences. So you had to use the first person pronoun. This assignment, it is not the case, right? So you're going to need to stay in the 3rd person. I noticed a lot of you, right? If you got a G3B written on your essay for the last essay, it's because you had sort of slipped into this rather informal and rather vague use of the 2nd person pronoun, where you address the writer rather, again, vaguely as you and your. I want you to avoid that. Okay, and I'm going to be bullish on this. If I see you writing you and your in the essay, I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to put a 50 on it. Okay, 3rd person academic point of view. What you can do to check this is, and I would encourage you to do this after you've written your essay, do a text find or a find search, Control F usually on the keyboard, and then type in the word you and hit enter and see if you have written you anywhere in the essay, and then you can recast your sentence and changing it into the 3rd person, and do the same thing for the word your. Okay. I'm going to ask again, as I mentioned earlier, that you have a clearly stated thesis in the introduction, one that includes reference to Frost's assertion about how a poem begins. Okay. I want you to use the primary text, in other words, the poem, to support your discussion. You're going to have to do that. You're going to have to quote relevant passages from the poem that support the points, the observation, the analysis that you are making about the poem. Make certain that you integrate these passages smoothly into your own prose, right, and that you document those textual citations using the MLA format. Now, you remember from the last essay or other essays that you've written, when you're writing about fiction, you often simply cite the page numbers in the parenthetical citations. When we're writing about poetry, and you need to cite a line in poetry, you simply, in the parentheses, need to write line, space, and then the page number. The line number, or line numbers, if what you are citing is more than one line of the poem. And if you look at that section in our textbook, and maybe even in the sample essay, I can't remember off the top of my head, if it shows this, but you can see how to deal with the mechanics of citing the lines of poetry. I want you to include a properly formatted works cited page, and again, we're using an anthology, so you would follow the MLA model that can be found on page 409 in your handbook, one selection from an anthology. That's how your works cited page should be formatted. And then I want you to submit the essay on or before the deadline via Blackboard. Okay, make sure that it's a Word document. All those other essay formatting and submission guidelines that we practiced and followed in the first essay apply here on the second essay as well. Okay. All right, let me pause here and then talk a little bit about some particular advice, some particular pitfalls that you want to avoid when writing this essay. Okay, so just a few reminders. Looks like maybe just 3 reminders right now to have in mind as you put together this assignment. You always want to remember that in your introduction, you always want to identify for your reader the author by his or her full name, and also identify the title of the poem that you are going to be writing about. Okay? With respect to the author's name, again, full name on the first reference in the introduction. You can refer to the author or the poet by last name on any and all subsequent references. Never ever refer to a poet or a writer by his or her first name. I know many of you are thinking, well, of course I would never do that. Trust me when I say you would be surprised. Imagine my shock, nay, I say the horror, when I read some years ago a student essay on William Shakespeare's, I think at that time I was doing Macbeth, and the writer of the essay referred to William Shakespeare not simply as Shakespeare, not even more informally as William, but referred to the bard himself as Bill. Yeah, it's not a good look. So keep that in mind. Secondly, and this is something I find myself marking time and time again on particularly this poetry essay. As you're writing your essay and you find yourself beginning to segue perhaps into a citation or a passage from the poem that you're going to quote, and you want to craft that signal phrase, when you're referring to that voice that we are hearing in the poem, we always refer to it as the speaker, not the narrator. Okay, never the narrator. And closely related to this idea is this reminder, and this is sometimes difficult for students to grasp. I can remember when I was a lad and sort of struggling with this concept as well. There's an impulse that we have when we're beginning to write about poetry in particular, where we want to conflate or combine or think that the speaker and the poet are one and the same. Okay? And this is not the case. So the reminder is this: poets can and quite often do create numerous speakers, okay, for the poems that they craft. And they are never, it's always a mistake to assume that it's the same voice from one poem to the next. It depends on the entire situation of the poem. I mean, you could, a poet using his or her imagination could craft a poem written from the point of the view of a piano, right, or a dog. So it's safe, it's not logical then to say that the poet and the speaker or the voice that we hear are one and the same. Nothing could be further from the truth. Speakers then can be thought of as being creations of poets. Certainly the voice that we hear is a creation of the poet, but it's not the poet himself or herself. So, for example, in Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays, which is a poem that is often used for this assignment, which is definitely a poem that fulfills, I think, Frost's observations about how a poem begins. But if we were to write something along these lines, this is how we would want to go about doing it. Hayden's speaker asks, quote, "What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?" So let's look at this example here. I want to point out just a couple of mechanical things to you. We have the author or the poet's last name, right? We're saying that it's Hayden's speaker, right? It's not Hayden. It's Hayden's speaker who asks, "What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?" Poignant final two lines of the poem. I want to draw your attention to the quoted passage itself. Line 13 is, "What did I know? What did I know?" And then you can see in my example here, there's a space and then there's a slash mark separating the words know and the word of. What that denotes is the separation of lines. Okay? So if you're writing a quote and you're quoting two lines, and the way you denote that line break is the way I have done it here in this example from Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays. So line 13 ends, the reader knows then that, oh, okay, line 13 ends at no, and then line 14 begins of love's austere and lonely offices. I want to draw your attention to two other things. Obviously, in the parentheses here, you're seeing line numbers, not page numbers. Okay, so remember that. I don't care that this poem shows up on page 365 in the textbook. When we're writing about poetry, we reference line numbers in the poems because, one reason is that poems appear in a lot of different places, but the line numbers of those poems never change. Okay, so that's why we use line numbers. All right. Just the second thing I was going to point out in this particular example, it's a little unique because the punctuation of the quote is a question, and when you are quoting something, generally, the punctuation comes here at the after the citation. But in this example, the quote is actually a question, isn't it? I mean, he's asking the question, "What did I know? What did I know?" And so the question mark, when you're quoting a passage that contains a question mark or an exclamation point in the original quotation that you're quoting, it actually is put inside the quotation mark, as I've done here for you. Okay. Finally, just as was the case with the previous essay, we always use the present tense when referring to actions taking place in the poem. Okay, I marked that an awful lot on the reflective essay. Despite cautioning you about it with the advice video and certainly in that little handout or document in our learning unit that had writing tips on writing about literature or something like that. Always use the present tense when you're doing this, when you're writing about what's going on in the poem. And I think I've explained this elsewhere, but just indulge me. The idea behind this decision stylistically is kind of interesting to me, at least, as someone who enjoys art and literature. Action is always taking place in the present whenever we are reading fiction, poetry, drama, or any time we're interacting with a work of art. the action is taking place, right? So it's not logical then to use past tense verbs when we're referring to what happened in a story or a poem or a play. So you want to check your, that's just one of these check sheets you want to do, or checks you want to do as you're editing your draft. Right? Make sure you look at those verb tenses, and make sure you're in the present tense when you're referring to what's going on in the particular poem that you're writing about. I'm trying to think of any last thing. Oh, let me give you one last bit since I've got you here, and I think you're still listening. I don't see you falling asleep. This is just a proofreading tip, and not sure if I have mentioned this to you elsewhere. I know I've pointed it out to you several individually, but as the class, proofreading tip, the single best proofreading tip ever. Never, ever proofread off of a screen. Okay? Take that to the bank. Don't ever do it. Your eyes will play tricks on you. So always print the paper. Okay? Always. And have it in front of you as a hard copy. Okay, that will, you'll be surprised what you will find on the printed out hard copy of the page that you do not see, or that you do see, that you don't see on the computer monitor. Always print the paper. Here's the other thing. Again, this is for proofreading and editing. You're looking for grammatical integrity, punctuation, spelling, subject-verb agreement, all of those sort of basic proofreading issues, right? So here's the tip. This is going to sound goofy, all right? Start at the end of the paper. Do not proofread a paper beginning by sitting down and reading it from beginning to end. Don't do it. When you're proofreading, start at the end of the paper, start with the last sentence. What, Dr. Calatrello? Yeah, start with the last sentence. Turn to the last page of your paper, look at the last sentence, and read it. Okay, if it makes sense, if it's a complete sentence, the subjects agree with the verbs, you haven't used I in it, you haven't used you and your pronouns agree with the antecedents, everything is copacetic, you've got punctuation correct, commas are where they're supposed to be, you have in fact a complete sentence, it's not a sentence fragment. Once you determine that that's a perfectly sound and correct sentence, go to the line that comes before the last, all right? They'll go to the line that precedes the last sentence and do the same thing, okay? Read it out loud. Look for your subjects and verbs. Is it a sentence, right? All those checklists, do you have commas in the right place? Do you have apostrophes where you need them? Do you have your pronouns functioning correctly? And again, once you've determined that it's a correct sentence, go to the sentence, repeat above, right? And then repeat, and repeat. Work your way backward through your manuscript, taking each sentence in isolation and examining it and determine that it is a correct, it is correct with punctuation, grammar, spelling, mechanics, usage, all of those qualities that make up the integrity of the written document. Okay, you're not reading for subject. You're not reading for content here. You're proofreading the paper. You have a different set of goggles on when you're proofreading and editing. You're not revising. You're proofreading and editing. Work your way backward. Print it out. Go to the last sentence. Read it. Work your way backward. You're going to be surprised what you find. Because what happens is when we sit down to read our manuscripts from beginning to end in a chronological way, we start with our introduction. We begin to read it. We have what I call our interior tape recorder starts playing. And we begin sort of reading through the draft for the 700th time. and your eyes begin to play tricks on you. You begin to see things that aren't there. You begin to provide words there that you may have forgotten to type. And so it's because you're so close. You're so close cognitively to your ideas as they are expressed on paper that you no longer have objectivity. Does that make sense? Right? Because you have read it so many times. And because of that, you miss things. You miss sentence fragments. You miss subject-verb agreements. You miss usage errors. You wrote T-O instead of T-O-O. So that's why this last reminder, this last tip that I'm giving you, trust me, you're going to thank me. Never, ever proofread off a screen. Always print the paper. Start at the end of the paper. Go to the last sentence. Examine it, read it, analyze it, pass it through your colon if you have to, until you're sure that it's correct. And then go to the line that comes before it, until you work your way backward through the manuscript and you end up at the first sentence. Okay? Listen, I've kept you longer than I had originally anticipated. And if you're still listening, good for you. I'll give you a stick of chewing gum the next time I see you. Listen, any questions? Don't hesitate to reach out. That's why I am here. Looking forward to this assignment. It's a good assignment. It's one that really it's fun. It's going to take you longer maybe than you think, so budget time for that. It requires an extraordinary amount of critical thinking because you have to not only understand what Frost is saying in his quote, but then you have to determine which poems that we have read seem to you to fulfill that observation that Frost makes. And then you have to argue. That's what you're doing. You're making a case saying that the poem that you have chosen truly does illustrate this idea about how a poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, right? A love sickness, a homesickness. It's good stuff. Listen, hope you guys are well, and let me hear from you if you have any questions. Bye-bye.